Let me ask you something. When you think of 1970s Britain, what comes to mind? The music, the fashion, the larger-than-life faces on your television screen every single night. These were the people you invited into your living room. What we are about to cover today is not gossip. It is not tabloid speculation. This is the verified, factual, and in many cases deeply disturbing history of 15 British entertainment figures whose private conduct was a complete and calculated betrayal of the public trust they had been given. Some of these men were exposed during their lifetimes. Others took their secrets to the grave. A few are remembered with genuine ambivalence. Talented people whose documented cruelty and abuse cannot simply be compartmentalized away because they were good at their jobs. This is not a nostalgia piece. This is a reckoning. Let's begin. 1. Jimmy Savile. There is no place to start this conversation other than here, because what Jimmy Savile represents is the most comprehensive and most devastating example of predatory behavior in the history of British broadcasting. Full stop. In the 1970s, Savile was not merely famous. He was a national institution. His image, the eccentric tracksuits, the ever-present cigar, the platinum hair, the tinted glasses, the "how's about that then" catchphrase, was one of the most recognizable in the country. He hosted Jim'll Fix It, one of the BBC's most beloved family programs. He ran charity marathons. He raised millions of pounds for Stoke Mandeville Hospital and other medical institutions. He had personal relationships with members of the royal family and sat comfortably among the highest levels of the British political establishment. He was knighted. He was given a papal knighthood. He was, and in every external measure, a pillar of British public life. It was all a mask. Following Savile's death in 2011, the Metropolitan Police launched Operation U-Tree, and a subsequent investigation produced the Smith Review in 2014. What those reports documented was staggering in its scale and its horror. Savile had used his position at the BBC, where he had virtually unchecked access to studios, dressing rooms, and production sets, to prey on victims systematically over a period spanning 4 decades. He had used his voluntary charity work at Stoke Mandeville Hospital, at Broadmoor High Security Psychiatric Hospital, and at the Leeds General Infirmary, not out of altruism, but as a calculated means of accessing vulnerable patients, including children and people with severe disabilities who had no ability to protect themselves or report what was happening to them. The official investigation identified over 450 victims. Investigators have stated openly that the true number is almost certainly higher. His victims ranged in age dramatically. The youngest were children. His crimes occurred in BBC dressing rooms, in hospital wards, in his caravan parked outside venues, and in his home. What placed Savile in a category entirely of his own was not just the volume of his crimes, but the architecture of protection he constructed around himself. He used his charitable reputation as a shield. He used his proximity to power, politicians, royals, police, as a deterrent to anyone who might speak. Former colleagues at the BBC have since confirmed that there were people who knew or suspected and said nothing. The culture of deference to celebrity that defined British broadcasting in the 1970s made Savile's crimes not only possible, but in a horrifying institutional sense, protected. He was untouchable, and he knew it. 2. Peter Wyngarde. Peter Wyngarde was the coolest man on British television in the early 1970s. As Jason King on Department S and its spin-off series, he was the definitive image of the suave, self-assured leading man, a fashion icon whose influence extended far beyond the screen. His fan club was enormous. His face was on magazine covers. He was, by every public measure, the man every viewer wanted to be or to be with. In 1975, Wyngarde was arrested for an act of public indecency in a public toilet in Gloucester. For the era, this was a career-ending scandal in itself. But what followed the arrest were a series of accounts from former colleagues, crew members, and co-stars that painted a far more complicated picture of who Wyngarde actually was on a day-to-day basis. The documented testimony from those who worked with him in the mid-1970s described a man of extreme arrogance who used his star power specifically to humiliate people beneath him in the production hierarchy. Junior staff, runners, supporting artists. These were the targets of a contempt that witnesses described not as occasional temper, but as deliberate and sustained cruelty. There are accounts of Wyngarde making demands that were designed to be impossible to meet, then using the inevitable failure as justification to publicly berate staff members. Productions were disrupted. Budgets were affected. His behavior, by multiple accounts, was that of a man who had concluded that his talent exempted him from ordinary human decency. His career never recovered from the 1975 arrest and the subsequent exposure of his conduct on set. 3. Richard Burton. Richard Burton is, without question, one of the greatest actors the British Isles ever produced. His voice alone was an instrument of extraordinary range and power. His stage work at the Old Vic established a legacy that few actors of any generation have matched. None of that is in dispute. What is also not in dispute, because Burton himself documented it, is what his alcoholism had turned him into by the 1970s. Burton's published diaries, along with Melvyn Bragg's biography based on those diaries, present a man who was acutely aware of his own destructiveness and largely unable or unwilling to stop it. His relationship with Elizabeth Taylor, one of the most scrutinized relationships in the history of global celebrity, was frequently defined during this period by what Burton himself described as psychological warfare and physical intimidation during episodes of severe intoxication. Taylor's own accounts and those of people in their inner circle confirm a pattern of volatile, frightening behavior that went well beyond what has sometimes been romantically framed as passion. On the set of the 1974 film The Klansman, Burton was reportedly so consistently and severely intoxicated that he was physically unable to stand unaided at various points during production. Yet he was simultaneously directing his considerable verbal intelligence toward abusing the crew and his co-stars with a precision and cruelty that left witnesses describing it as traumatic. He was not a man who lost control of what he was saying when drunk. He was a man who used drink as a license to say the cruelest things he was capable of thinking. The tragedy of Burton is real. His talent was real. But so were the documented experiences of everyone who got too close to the fire. 4. Tony Hancock. Tony Hancock's contribution to British comedy is genuinely historic. Hancock's Half Hour, both the radio series and the television adaptation, represents some of the finest situation comedy ever produced in this country. The character of Anthony Aloysius St. John Hancock, the pompous, self-deluding everyman of railway cuttings, East Cheam, is a towering achievement. Hancock dismantled everything that built him with a deliberateness that can only be described as calculated destruction. He fired Ray Galton and Alan Simpson, the writers who had created every word he spoke, every routine that made him famous, the entire architecture of his success, out of what biographers and contemporaries have consistently characterized as professional jealousy. He pushed Sid James, his perfect comic foil, entirely out of his professional life for the same reason. These were not impulsive decisions. They were systematic removals of anyone whose contribution to his success was too visible for his ego to accommodate. What followed, documented in extensive detail in the biography When the Laughter Stopped, was a spiral that consumed not only Hancock's career, but the people around him. His wives and collaborators in the late 1960s and early 1970s described a man whose bitterness had curdled into something genuinely cold. The mistreatment was not explosive. It was methodical. He died by suicide in Australia in 1968, leaving a note that has been widely quoted and which reveals a man who understood at the end the emptiness he had engineered through his own choices. 5. Oliver Reed. Oliver Reed in the 1970s was a legitimate force of cinema. Oliver, The Devils, The Three Musketeers. He worked with Ken Russell, Richard Lester, and carried every film he was in with a magnetic, dangerous energy that was genuinely rare. He was also, by extensive documented account, genuinely dangerous. The Hellraiser persona that Reed cultivated publicly has sometimes been treated as colorful eccentricity. The reality, as described by co-stars, crew members, and people who encountered him socially during this period, was considerably darker. He started a restaurant brawl that ended with him being stabbed. He would strip naked in public spaces and physically harass people who were unable to remove themselves from the situation. His treatment of women was described repeatedly and by multiple sources as predatory and aggressive rather than merely crude. On film sets, Reed created what witnesses consistently called an atmosphere of fear. His requirement that everyone drink with him, cast, crew, directors, producers, was not a social invitation. It was a dominance ritual. Those who declined were subjected to a physical and psychological pressure that multiple accounts describe as a form of intimidation. He was not simply a man who drank too much and got loud. He was a man who used his physical size, his status, and his capacity for unpredictable violence to control every environment he entered. 6. Peter O'Toole. Peter O'Toole is one of the most gifted actors of the 20th century. Lawrence of Arabia alone secures that position in perpetuity. By the 1970s, however, O'Toole's drinking had moved him from the category of charismatic hellraiser into something his own family and colleagues described with significantly less affection. The book Hellraisers, which documents the collective destruction of O'Toole, Burton, Reed, and Richard Harris, contains accounts from those in O'Toole's immediate circle about what his blackout drinking episodes produced. His wife, actress Sian Phillips, he wrote in her own memoir about the psychological torment she endured during their marriage. O'Toole, by her account, and by the accounts of others who were close to him, was a master of verbal cruelty during these episodes, using his formidable vocabulary and intellectual precision as a weapon to systematically undermine the self-worth of people he was supposed to love and protect. On set during his 1970s work, O'Toole's documented habit of drawing younger actors into extended drinking sessions with complete disregard for their health, their contractual obligations, or the impact on their developing careers, reflects a selfishness that went beyond simple excess. His attitude, as described by contemporaries, was one of a man who had decided that the ordinary rules of conduct simply did not apply to him, and who took a particular pleasure in demonstrating that conviction. 7. John Le Mesurier. John Le Mesurier occupies a slightly different position on this list, and it is important to be precise about what the documented facts actually are. Le Mesurier himself was not a man whose conduct was cruel or predatory. His reputation, then and now, was one of extraordinary gentleness. What his story exposes is the culture around him, the culture of 1970s celebrity, and the behavior of those closest to him. His third wife, Joan Malin, entered into an affair with Tony Hancock, Le Mesurier's friend and one of the most famous men in British entertainment. This was not a private failing that remained private. Within the industry, it became known, and what documented accounts from the period describe is not simple scandal, but a specific culture within the British entertainment world of the 1970s in which Le Mesurier's dignity and loyalty were treated as weaknesses to be exploited rather than qualities to be respected. Hancock, even in the final deteriorating period of his life, was by accounts still wielding the situation to cause pain. Le Mesurier, by contrast, responded with a public graciousness that was widely noted and which, in context, makes the behavior of those around him appear all the more calculated and cruel. His story is the story of what happened to decent people in that world. 8. Bill Maynard. Bill Maynard built a long career in British television across both comedy and drama, and was recognized as a capable and versatile performer over several decades. behind the cameras. His behavior during the 1970s was documented by co-stars and production crew in terms that go significantly beyond the standard difficult to work with designation. Multiple accounts describe Maynard running his sets through a combination of arrogance and deliberate bullying, targeting specifically junior actors and new arrivals to productions, forcing them to cry in front of assembled casts and crews in what witnesses described as a demonstration of dominance rather than a loss of temper. He demanded script changes that served exclusively his own character and profile, often at direct cost to other performers' roles and to the narrative coherence of the production itself. And the consistency of these accounts across multiple productions and from multiple independent sources is what elevates Maynard's documented conduct from difficult personality to something more intentional: the systematic use of professional power to damage the confidence and careers of people who had no recourse. 9. Stewart Granger. Stewart Granger was a legitimate star of the 1940s and 1950s. King Solomon's Mines, Scaramouche, Beau Brummel, a leading man of considerable charisma and commercial power in the classical Hollywood mode. By the 1970s, that era was definitively over, and Granger's bitterness about that fact became the defining feature of his professional conduct. In his own autobiography, Sparks Fly Upward, and through accounts from his contemporaries, Granger's malice toward the new generation of performers and filmmakers is extensively documented. He was openly contemptuous of directors on 1970s television productions and used his historical status as a battering ram against people trying to simply do their jobs. He was physically aggressive on set. He was quoted directly as stating that he hated most of the people he worked with. The account that appears most frequently in discussion of this period involves Granger's treatment of a young actress on a 1970s television production, an attack so personally vicious that she left the production entirely rather than continue to work alongside him. His conduct was not the standard grumpiness of a man out of his time. By consistent account, it was targeted, deliberate, and designed to cause maximum harm to people he had decided he resented. 10. The top of the pops culture. Dave Lee Travis and others. This entry is not about a single individual, but about a documented collective culture within 1970s British music television that the Operation Yewtree investigations subsequently brought into public record. Top of the Pops in the 1970s was the most powerful weekly music program in Britain. The DJs and presenters who hosted it, figures including Dave Lee Travis, among others, caught up in the subsequent investigations, occupied a cultural status that it is difficult to fully communicate to anyone who didn't live through the era. They were gods of popular culture. Their approval made careers. Their access was total. The Operation Yewtree reports, along with survivor testimony gathered during the investigations of the 2000s and 10s, document a culture within the Top of the Pops environment in which the backstage areas of BBC studios were used systematically to access young fans, predominantly teenage girls, who had been brought backstage under false pretenses or who were too young and too starstruck to understand what was being done to them. The documented accounts describe not isolated incidents, but a shared and organized network in which information about vulnerable individuals was passed between multiple perpetrators. Witnesses and investigators used the word industrial in describing the scale. The culture of silence that surrounded it was maintained through a combination of the performer's power, industry complicity, and the straightforward fact that no one in authority wanted to damage the BBC's most successful entertainment franchise. When these facts emerged publicly, the damage was not merely reputational. It broke something in the collective memory of an entire generation. 11. Sid James. Sid James as Sid Plummer, Sid Boggle, Sid Roper, the Carry On film's lovable, lecherous everyman, is a legitimate piece of British comedy history. His laugh alone is iconic. The reality of his conduct toward his co-star Barbara Windsor, however, is documented extensively both in Windsor's own autobiography and in the historical record of the Carry On productions. James's pursuit of Windsor was not, by her account or by the accounts of witnesses, romantic. It was a sustained campaign of pressure, monitoring, and psychological manipulation conducted from a position of professional power. And he used his status as the franchise's top-billed male star to ensure Windsor was repeatedly cast alongside him. Not, she has stated, out of professional admiration, but so he could maintain constant proximity to her. When Windsor declined his advances, the documented response was not acceptance. It included threats against her career, and, by her account, threats of self-harm directed at her as a form of emotional coercion. Beyond his treatment of Windsor, James's gambling addiction produced a documented pattern of borrowing money from production crew members, working-class people with no leverage and no ability to refuse the request of the production's biggest star, with no recorded intention of repayment. This left multiple people in genuine financial difficulty, while James continued to live at a level of comfort they could not have imagined. 12. Freddie Starr. Freddie Starr in the 1970s was considered one of the most unpredictably brilliant comedy performers in Britain, a man of genuine improvisational talent whose stage presence was electric and whose capacity for physical comedy was exceptional. The documented testimony from those who worked with him on 1970s variety productions describes an environment of sustained fear rather than creative excitement. Starr's physical violence toward staff, striking crew members when a prop was incorrectly placed or a joke failed to land, is recorded in multiple accounts from that period. His eccentricity, celebrated publicly as the mark of a genius, was used internally as justification for behavior that anyone in a less powerful position would have faced immediate consequences for. The investigations of the 2000s and 2010s produced allegations of serious misconduct against young fans during the 1970s period. Allegations that fall within the broader documented pattern of backstage access being weaponized against young people who had no understanding of what they were walking into. 13. Wilfrid Brambell. Wilfrid Brambell as Albert Steptoe is one of the finest sustained comedy performances in British television history. The character, the writers, and his partnership with Harry H. Corbett created something genuinely extraordinary. The partnership itself, however, was a fiction maintained entirely for professional reasons. Harry H. Corbett's family and documented accounts from the Steptoe and Son productions describe a working relationship that was defined by mutual contempt, with Brambell's conduct being specifically documented as deliberately designed to make Corbett's professional life as difficult as possible. Brambell arrived at recordings in states of intoxication that rendered him incapable of performing, placing the burden of carrying the production entirely on Corbett, while the credits and the financial rewards were shared equally. This was not an occasional problem. It was a consistent pattern over a sustained period. During the production's 1970s Australian tour, Brambell's behavior was documented as including public incidents and an arrest for public indecency. Accounts from those tours describe his conduct toward fans as contemptuous, and the psychological element, the documented fact that Brambell was aware of how trapped Corbett felt in the show and used that knowledge as leverage to make every working day more miserable, elevates the situation beyond simple professional dysfunction into something considerably more calculated. 14. Clement Freud. Sir Clement Freud was, by every visible measure, one of the more distinguished figures of 1970s public life. He was a celebrated chef. He was a member of Parliament. He was a regular and beloved panelist on Just a Minute for decades. His dry, sardonic wit was a fixture of British broadcasting. He carried the weight of one of the most famous intellectual surnames in Western history. He was, apparently, a thoroughly respectable man. In 2016, a documentary produced by ITV brought forward witness accounts and documented evidence that revealed Freud to have spent decades using his status, his respectability, and his access to high society, specifically to conceal a pattern of predatory behavior toward children that dated back to the 1970s. Witnesses described in specific terms how Freud used his grandfatherly public persona as cover, how the warmth and trustworthiness he projected publicly was the mechanism by which he gained access to victims. The particular horror of the Clement Freud case is its illustration of how completely the British establishment of the 1970s could protect those within its circle. Freud was a member of Parliament. He was knighted. He had every institutional credential available. All of it functioned as insulation. The investigation that finally produced public accountability came only after his death, and only because witnesses came forward to an independent documentary production. The 1970s in British entertainment produced some genuinely remarkable work. The performances, the music, the television, some of it is lasting, some of it is historic, and some of it remains genuinely powerful. But the history of that era cannot be told honestly without telling this part of it. These 15 cases, from the industrial-scale predation of Jimmy Savile to the documented cruelty of Stewart Granger, to the institutional network exposed by Operation Yewtree, to the posthumous revelations about Clement Freud, are not footnotes. They are the full picture. They are what was happening behind the performances you were watching. The lesson that keeps emerging from every one of these documented cases is the same. Fame and talent are not character. The ability to perform for a camera or command a stage tells you nothing about what a person does with power when no one is filming. And the 1970s British entertainment world operated on a system of deference to celebrity that allowed powerful people to believe they were untouchable. And for a long time, they were right. The victims in these cases waited years. Some waited decades. Some did not live to see any form of public acknowledgement of what had been done to them. Their accounts, when they finally emerged, changed the way Britain understood its own recent history. That understanding is the least they are owed.